right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for today's session. We'll be getting started in just a bit, but I did have a couple of things that I wanted to say before we get started. So first off, my name is Maxine Nebro. I work as a client services specialist at Tutor.com. I'll be moderating today's session, so if you do have any technical issues, you can always submit those questions through the question box, and I'd be happy to kind of walk you through all of that. As well, if you do have any questions throughout the entire presentation, by all means, let us know. Submit those questions in the question box. At the very end of the presentation, we will have some time for some questions, and I'll be going through all of those with some of you. But as you know, this is just one of our sessions of our Student Success webinar series, so that means that there are more coming up. The next one is going to be about overcoming test anxiety, something I wish I had back in high school and college. So be sure to sign up for that. But otherwise, I think we're ready to get started. So I'm going to be joined today by my colleague, Dr. Amy Dietzman, who has created and led this series since back when it was first created at the start of the pandemic. So without further ado, I'll just pass it on over to her.
Thanks, Maxine. Hi, everybody. I'm Amy Dietzman, and I am excited to talk to you today about one of my favorite subjects. I'm a total nerd because I love writing. I love talking about writing. I love teaching writing. And today we're going to discuss some ways that you can become a better writer. We're going to identify how you can decode assignment directions so you can get right to what your instructor is looking for. And we're going to explore the significance of writing rubrics and how you can use them to get better grades. And since writing and academic integrity go hand in hand, we're also going to talk today a little bit about how to avoid plagiarism. So before we talk about writing, we need to start with reading. Reading makes you a better writer. William Faulkner said, "Read everything. Trash, classics, good and bad, and see how they do it. Just like a carpenter who works as an apprentice and studies the master, read." Solid writing isn't just for writing papers, though. We use writing for everything these days. We send emails, we send text messages, and this one is the one I really wanted to share with you because this is a text message that actually came from my phone. And it reads, "Good morning, Amy. Hope you're doing well. Designed by, do you guys know I will text you this afternoon when I'm heading your way because I was sheriff. Should be after 4 when I will get there today, but I will text you and let you know." Whew. Now, I'm not really sure if he's with the sheriff, but I think he said he's coming after 4. He's going to text me and let me know. So this is a simple case of firing off a text message without proofing it. And we all do this. I mean, I send off text messages all the time and have typos or autocorrects. But I'll be honest, this guy sent me text messages like this numerous times. So what does it say about him? See, people with stronger writing skills are perceived as more reliable and trustworthy. Honing in this skill set will not only help you in your current job, but will help you move up the corporate ladder. A study by Grammarly noted that those with fewer grammatical errors in their writing correlated to more promotions and higher salaries. So writing is really important, although these text messages were funny. So we know that writing takes us farther in our careers. Solid writing also helps us to get along with others better. When you consider that so many companies have gone remote, or at least have remote options, a great deal of communication has shifted from face-to-face to online. We rely heavily on email, text, and instant messenger platforms, and in a matter of seconds, your short email or IM exchange can either charm someone or turn them off completely, and it can be done very well by mistake. Writing in school is so much more prevalent than it used to be. With the online classroom, discussions that would often take place face-to-face are now taking place in forums, and our instructors are grading us on them. Almost every class has a written component or a research paper, and years ago, this was not the norm. But writing effectively will take you farther in school and your career. So, how can we become more confident in our writing? To become a better writer, you want to start by expanding your vocabulary. Spend some time wordsmithing. Find words that better express what you're trying to convey. But be careful with the thesaurus. I've read many papers where I can tell that the student went crazy with the thesaurus and the sentences no longer make sense. So you have to know the part of speech for the words that you're looking to replace. You want to replace an adjective with an adjective and a verb with a verb. And one suggestion is just look through your paper and see if you have continually used one word over and over again. See, we tend to do that. If so, replace it with something else to help the flow of your paper. And then, let me just give you an example. When I was writing my dissertation, I had to describe other researchers' work a lot. So I might say something like, so-and-so said this, or so-and-so wrote that. Well, said and wrote are super boring words. So I made a list of better verbs to use, and I wrote them all out. And when I was writing, I would just look down at my list, find a better word, and plug it in. So there's a little tip for you. When it comes to increasing your writing brain and abilities, it's not always best to go with what's easy. If easy doesn't inspire you in some way, you're going to struggle to write that paper. It's better to choose topics that you care about. Choose topics that connect to your skills, your interests, your future, people you know, or just topics that challenge you in a good way. Research and writing can be enjoyable if you have a passion about it. So let's get into it. You get an assignment. You read through the prompt and you're immediately overwhelmed. Now it's time to break it down. The first thing to do is read and break apart the directions. Ask yourself these questions. What's the most important point here? What is the purpose of this assignment? Is my purpose to provide information without forming an argument? To construct an argument based on research? Maybe it's to analyze the poem and discuss its imagery. And then ask yourself, who's my audience? Is my instructor my only audience? Who else might read this? Will it be posted online? What are my readers' needs and expectations? Then go back and break apart each section of the prompt. And here's some tips. A lot of times instructors say something like, write a paper and address the following things. And then they list out in bullet points all the things you're supposed to do. Well, it's important to read each bullet point very, very closely to make sure that they aren't asking you to do 2 things in each bullet. Sometimes in our haste to get started, we miss that they're asking us to do 6 things instead of what we originally thought was only 4. So I'm a color coder, so I would color code each thing they were asking me to do. Then I'd number those things in a way that made the most sense to me. Sometimes our papers aren't in the exact order as the assignment. You can mix it up sometimes. And then I would use those color codes as I wrote to ensure I didn't forget anything once I started. Now, it's easy to do that, so remember to keep your assignment directions close. Consider printing them, use highlighters, and keep those directions next to you as you form your paper. So we're going on about how to decode directions. Well, action words are very important in an assignment. It's a good idea to circle all the action words in the prompt so you get a clear understanding of what is being asked of you. If you are asked to summarize something, that's very different than analyzing. Summarizing is putting something into your own words. It's a pretty simple task. But analyzing is a little deeper than that. It's interpreting and examining evidence, and it requires a more in-depth explanation. So you want to make sure that you don't summarize something when you should have been analyzing it. One very important distinction, and a mistake I see so often from students, is compare and contrast. Compare and contrast is much different than just discussing 2 things. You have to actually indicate how 2 things are the same and how they are different. Not just explain one thing and then explain the other thing. So take the time to identify those action words and consider what you're being asked to do. If you don't know what you're being asked to do, then that's when you need to use your resources. Talk to a tutor. A tutor can help you decode directions and clarify the assignment. They don't always just help with just the assignment. They can help before you even start. It's also a good idea to ask your instructor if you need to. It's always best to clarify the assignment rather than spinning your wheels for hours, feeling really unconfident and then wasting time and getting nowhere. So let's look at a few examples. Each of these words will make you write a different kind of essay. In particular, these words limit the scope of your essay. So if you're asked to compare the politics of Ronald Reagan and Barack Obama, you will not be taking a position about whose politics you prefer. Comparing is not the same thing as forming an argument or an opinion. If you're asked to describe the use of humor in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, you are not critiquing. And if you are asked to summarize the findings of multiple scientific research papers, you are not presenting your own findings. What action words tell you in a prompt is how you will approach your subject. Once you know what you're going to write about and what evidence you will be using in your essay, then you need to organize your essay by preparing an outline. These can be super simple. You don't have to spend hours preparing an outline, but it's super not really very fun. It's not the fun part, but it's the key to making sure you know what you're going to say and you have a roadmap, and so that you aren't just writing stuff and then later you come back and you go, none of this goes together. That's what you want to avoid, because then again, you're wasting time. So always start with your introduction. The main element of your introduction is always your thesis statement, but you also need to start with a hook. And it's some small thing that grabs the reader's attention and pulls them in. You do not need to write your hook for your outline, but you need to have an idea and maybe make note of it. Remember, this is the hook. It's not the whole fishing rod. You're going to reel your reader in to agree with your argument throughout the rest of your essay. Then the all-important thesis statement, it usually comes at the end of the introduction paragraph. And I will say sometimes your thesis statement will not reveal itself to you until you have all of your body paragraphs fleshed out a little bit. So a lot of people think they have to start with the thesis, and my advice to you is if it's just not coming to you, don't start there. Next, you're going to build out your body paragraphs. To better show you how these should look, we're just only going to look at one body paragraph. So just pretend like you have a bunch, but this is just one. First, you're going to write out your main idea of that paragraph. Think of this as like a mini thesis statement for just that paragraph. Then you want to list at least 3 pieces of evidence that you have found that support that main idea. These can be references that only you understand, as long as you're sure that you can reference your evidence later. You also don't always need 3 pieces of evidence in every single paragraph, but maybe you'll have more than that, maybe you'll have less, but it's good to start there, lean towards having 3, and then you're more likely to have enough evidence when you get to writing. And then after you outline all your introduction and body paragraphs, then you outline your conclusion. In the conclusion, you're going to restate your thesis. And this should not be word for word exactly as you wrote it at the beginning. This should be a slight revision, maybe a little more emphasis, but your thesis is still the key to your essay and needs to be brought back up in the conclusion. Then take 1 sentence to summarize each of your body paragraphs. You don't need to do that in your outline, but just write a brief summary as a note to yourself. Now, I know what a lot of you might be thinking. Well, this is a pretty simple, straightforward, like 5-paragraph essay. Seems like this is the most basic thing I've always been taught since 3rd grade. Well, there is good reason for that. What you've always been taught as a structure to write an essay is really pretty fantastic. If you get more comfortable, maybe your 3 ideas move into multiple paragraphs for each idea. This is just a beginning. This is not the best version of an essay possible, but it is a guaranteed way to make your essay work from the start. So let's talk about some steps for better writing. First of all, don't rush. Writing is a process. It takes time, consideration, planning, and revising. This goes hand in hand with avoiding procrastination. I always talk about this in almost every student success webinar, but remember that you sell the process short if you don't give yourself time to go through the whole writing process because you put it off until the last minute. As I've said, procrastinators get lower grades than those who do the work ahead of time. Proven fact. Sometimes when I was writing for school, I would read a prompt, think through the steps, make my outline, do all my research, and then not even write at all during that session. Sometimes I found that if I researched and then went for a walk or did something else, I could use that time to process and form the argument in my head. Next is, revise. If you really crank out the text and experiment and just let things flow, you're going to need to go back over it. Many writers hate revising because it seems like so much work. They've already done the writing. But if you want to be a good writer, you need to learn the revision process, because revision is where the good writing really comes out. It separates the mediocre from the great. Go back over everything, looking not only for grammar and spelling, those are important, but for unnecessary words, awkward structures, confusing sentences. Aim for clarity, for strength, and for freshness. In your revision process, don't forget to read it out loud. Hearing it and hearing where you pause, where you trip up, where you need to take a breath, that'll help you edit more effectively. A lot of people don't read it out loud. Make sure you do that. Start and end strong. The most important parts of writing are the beginning and the end. See, the beginning sets the roadmap for your paper and helps both you and your reader with expectations. And the end is the last thing your instructor reads before they give you a grade. So it's pretty important that it be good. Spell and grammar check. Don't forget to do this. Grammar check often catches words that are spelled correctly, but also incorrectly. So you know those words that have two spellings and mean two different things, like cite and cite, S-I-T-E and then C-I-T-E. That's a good example, but there's tons of them. Students make this mistake a lot. They put the wrong one throughout their paper, and your spell check doesn't necessarily catch that. Usually it doesn't because it's spelled correctly. Your grammar check might find that for you. Not always, but sometimes. So that's why it's an important step. And then check the rubric. Last, very important and often missed step of being a good academic writer is the rubric, which I'm going to talk a lot about in just a second. Let's talk about the little things you can do that always make writing unclear. If you hear these and you think, oh, I do that, well, then all I have to say to you is, well, of course you do. These are writing problems even professional writers have. So for your academic essay writing, you need to make sure that you clearly articulate your thesis throughout your essay. To clearly articulate anything, you need to pay attention to the little things. You need to avoid redundancies, which is not just saying the same thing over and over again, but saying the same thing in different ways. Try to mix things up and show your range, and be especially wary of repetition in the conclusion of your essay. You can also make sure that you are focusing on the right word choice, not just how many words you are using. There's a difference between use and utilize, or build and fabricate, or think and realize. Choosing the correct word will make your writing stronger. You also need to watch out when you use pronouns. If you are writing about 3 women talking and you keep saying she did this, but she did that, your reader will have a tough time knowing who's doing what. So make sure it's clear who a pronoun refers to when you use one. You also want to avoid wordiness. We all want to sound smart, and we think that if we use more words, then we're going to sound smarter. But usually you just make it confusing. You want to eliminate as much of the fluff as possible from your essay. Be concise, get to your point, and make it clearly. You must also make sure that you are using the correct word tense throughout your essay. Many students shift between present tense, and they talk about past tense, and then they talk about what may happen in the future, all within one sentence or paragraph. And this gets extremely confusing for the reader. Always make sure that all of your word tenses are in agreement with each other. Usually, rule of thumb, it's usually best to write in the past tense when you're talking about history and research, because these are things that have already happened. But the key objective is just to be clear. And finally, you need to watch your sentence structure, especially when you've gone through many changes and edits. Sometimes you'll copy paste certain parts of sentences, and then other parts get left standing away from where they were first written. And now you're left with all these odd fragments or run-ons that you didn't catch because you become so familiar with your own writing that sometimes you don't see it. That's why reading it out loud is so important, because that's where you'll catch those things. Let's talk about the importance of the rubric. All right, well, instructors use rubrics to grade. And if they're going to have this thing in front of them while giving you a grade, then you should probably review it very closely. It lists everything that will be graded, and sometimes directions miss things. Hidden curriculum could be in the rubric. It's a small thing that a lot of instructors actually overlook. In instructional design, we used to call this hidden curriculum. See, the assignment could tell you you need to use evidence. And then you open up the rubric, and the rubric says you need to use 5 to 6 pieces of evidence from at least 3 different sources. You can see how important that rubric became when it came to this very important detail. If you had just read the directions, you may have only included 2 pieces of evidence, and then you would lose critical points. Once you've read the rubric and ensured that your paper is meeting the criteria, you can confidently submit that assignment knowing you've done your best work. A great way to look at a rubric is like this one. They don't all look this way. I wish they did. See how the top row is laid out? There's a column for an A paper, a B paper, and so on. If you're interested in getting an F, well, then you can just look at that last column. But I know a lot of students who are going to give it at least half a shot. They're fine with a B or a C. Does that mean they should only look at the C paper column, middle of the road, meet most of the requirements? No, you don't want to go that way, because you might think that you've met the requirements, but your instructor may think that you haven't, and now you're flirting with the D. Your best bet is to pretty much ignore the entire rubric except for the A column. That's what you're striving for. It doesn't mean you'll get it, but it does at least mean that you're including all the necessary criteria and then some. In most rubrics, this will say something like excellent or excelling or exceeds expectations. This doesn't mean that you've written a really good paper. It means you've written a better than expected paper. So how do you read a rubric? Well, my advice always is to print it out and print out a copy of the assignment directions, put them side by side, and note if anything in the rubric looks different than in the assignment directions. If you notice something more specific in one place or another, highlight it, copy it over, make sure you've caught on that sometimes these don't match. You want to look for any verbs or anything that's telling you specifically what to include in your assignment. So let me show you how I would read this rubric. Look at the Ideas A paper box that's circled. I'm going to highlight, or I'm going to underline a couple things. Here it says critically evaluates its sources. This tells me I'm not supposed to just slap some sources in my essay. I'm supposed to actually evaluate them. Here I'm also supposed to limit and define terms. Well, naturally, when I include terms in my paper, I don't always define them because I assume my instructor knows these terms. But here are a few extras I should try to do. Limit and define. Interesting. If there's anything here I'm unsure about, I have a concern or a question, or I want to make sure I come back and check again, I would underline that. Maybe that's an area where I need tutoring. Maybe that's a question I have for the instructor. Another thing to consider, I just want to point out real quickly, is that each of these columns is a range. If you get into the A column, that could be a 93%, could be a 95%. It doesn't always mean 100%. So more than once I've had students inquire and say, hey, I got all along the first column, but I didn't get 100% of my paper. I myself, as an instructor, reserve 100% for perfection, and perfection is rarely achieved. So just remember, like a B could be an 80%, it could be an 89%. And sometimes you want the higher grade, usually. All right, get feedback as early as you can in a class. Then apply it before you submit another paper so you don't make the same mistakes twice. Don't take instructor feedback personally. See it as a way to help you learn and grow and become a better writer, a stronger student, a smarter student, And don't expect perfection. Many of us think that feedback means we're just not doing a good job. But feedback means you have room to grow. If you didn't have room to grow, you wouldn't be in school. So expect that you are going to do the best you can, you're improving in every paper you write, and you're going to get feedback. I would be remiss if I didn't mention plagiarism. See, you're never going to be a good writer if you don't write your own stuff. You're never going to have the satisfaction of learning or gaining confidence from submitting your own work if you submit someone else's. Plagiarism is the easy way out, and at least 40% of students admit to cheating on written assignments. Those are the ones who know they're doing it. Deliberate plagiarizers. Deliberate plagiarizing is knowingly copying and pasting something from a source without citing it, or buying a paper online. People do that. But there's another thing called accidental plagiarism, which is what I find most students do. And this is when you just don't take good notes. You don't remember that you read something somewhere, and then you put it into your paper. This comes from being disorganized in your research process. But I want to point out that you don't want to let fear of plagiarism paralyze you. A lot of students they hear about it so much now that they're just afraid all the time that they're doing it. Think of it this way. You're doing your best to be honest. If someone told you a really good story and you were really into it, such a good story, it was so good that you wanted to make sure you remembered it well so that you could relay that story and tell someone else. So you'd listen pretty intently. You'd commit that to your memory, and then you'd hold on to it as best you could so you could do it justice when you told someone else, right? This is the same principle. You're taking in really good information, you're respecting that information, and you want to make sure you give credit to the person who shared that information with you. That's all you need to worry about. Let's talk about academic integrity. When you sit down to research and write, you need to be very methodical about how you take notes. Document articles that you're reading and you're gathering ideas from them. All of these things need to be really well defined. And whatever your process is, you have to find your own system, but it should be a well-defined system. And that'll also help you with your confidence. There is no better feeling, well, in my opinion, and I told you I'm a writing nerd, but in my opinion, than getting a topic for an assignment, having no clue what you want to write about, beginning the research process, and then very clearly having your paper come into focus. Beginning to form a clear argument, reading articles that support your thoughts, and then click. I know exactly what I'm going to write, and it's going to be good. Something I've often seen is a reference page with 6 articles listed, and only 3 of them are actually cited in the paper. I've also read long dissertation proposals, hundreds of pages, where citations exist all throughout the document, and there is no matching reference on the reference page. This is a big no-no. You want to take time to make sure all of this is checked and rechecked. The reference page matches all the citations within your document. All right, I know it's a lot, only a little bit left. So quickly, we're going to talk about the research process. Research is a 5-step process. Most papers that you write in high school and college are research papers. They may not be labeled as such, but if you have to find evidence for your paper, then it's research. The first step is searching, Googling, going through the library, finding books or videos. Second step, note-taking. Taking what you found in your search, assimilating it, and figuring out how you're going to incorporate it into your topic and into the argument of your paper. Third step, outlining and writing. Writing is much more than a copy-paste endeavor. It takes critical thinking and deep concentration. As you write, you begin to back up your own thoughts with the thoughts and the research of experts. And this is why those citations are so important. Step 4 is giving credit, citing and formulating your reference page. And then step 5 is revising. We talked about this already, but many writers skip this because they're tired. They run out of time. They're sick of thinking about this paper. Schedule time for revision, and your best revision session is one with a fresh brain. So write one day and revise the next. Where do you find credible sources for your research? Let's go over this quickly. Many libraries, schools, and universities have electronic databases. Look for a database link on your local library or school website. Check out ProQuest and ERIC for scholarly articles. You can also look through the New York Times archives for historical sources, which brings me to primary sources, meaning use the original document and not someone else's summary of it. If you read someone's summary of something and you want to use it, go to the original source. It's better to quote the original author rather than someone else who's quoting or summarizing the original author. Think about it as a game of telephone. The more people who take what someone said, the better chance they have of interpreting it in their own way, right? So every time someone cites a source, they're interpreting it and maybe changing it just a little. So you want to go to the primary source. Look at the domain suffix. This means if it's a .edu, a .gov, a .org. In general, these are reliable sources on the web, but beware of political sites. Use those kinds of sites with caution, checking for credibility and authority. Company websites end in .com and professional organizations end in .org. So just be aware, both of these they could work, but they have an agenda and they could be promoting something specific. Over the years, Wikipedia has become more reliable as a general source of information. Some instructors will allow you to cite Wikipedia in your paper and others won't. However, Wikipedia is a really great starting point. You can use the references section of each Wikipedia entry because those have all kinds of source material. So scroll all the way down to the bottom of the entry on Wikipedia. You'll find a list of resources related to your topic, and a lot of times they have links. So this is great. Just click the link and off you go. You can also use Google Scholar, and I put that at the top. You've never tried Google Scholar. It's a great database of research-based materials. Don't forget to check the dates of your source. If you're citing something that's more than 5 or 10 years old, it is no longer credible. More research has likely been done. The world has changed. Issues have changed. The only time, of course, that this is not applicable is when you're citing a primary source or a historic event. Obviously, that's not going to change. Examine the author's credentials. If you're not sure whether or not the author is credible, look them up and see what they do, and then go with your instincts. The only way to get better at writing is to do it over and over. If you have an opportunity to practice writing in any context, take it. If you're in a meeting and someone needs to take notes for everybody else, volunteer. If you have questions about something and you're usually the person who picks up the phone, try writing out a succinct email instead. Now, these kinds of activities are low-stakes writing. You're not getting graded. You're just practicing the art of putting together your thoughts, editing, revising, proofing, and then sharing. Practice, and you will begin to feel more confident about your writing, and you will see your own improvement. And as you're writing, ask for help from a tutor. I said that a few times, but we have tutoring for essay writing, and our tutors can help you all throughout your process. When you're just clarifying what the assignment's asking for, when you have a rough draft and you want someone to tell you if your ideas are on the right track, or when you're looking to polish up your assignment. Tutoring can help you gain confidence, so think about trying that. And this is what I mean about confidence. This is a student comment from Tutor.com. Says, thank you so much for your review. I appreciate the time you took to read over my document. Your feedback really boosted my confidence in submitting my assignment. If you're interested in where I came up with some of this stuff, that wasn't my own experience. I did find a few resources there for you. And as Maxine said, our next webinar is coming up again next Friday at noon, and it's called Overcoming Test Anxiety. I'm going to talk about a lot of different types of tests, not just like the standard SAT, ACT, MCAT, those kinds of things, but I'm also going to talk about just like tests in general when your instructor gives you a final exam and you feel really anxious about it. And now we'll take some questions.
All right, thank you so much, Amy. Fantastic presentation as always. And I know that we're already getting comments in the question box just saying that this was super helpful. And I know personally, when you were talking about reading a rubric. That would have been great information for me to have in high school and college, because I know I was severely disappointed time and time again, simply because I just misinterpreted what it was saying and didn't like really pay enough attention. So I
Hmm.
think that's going to be really helpful for people. So there are a couple of things before we get to the questions. First, definitely follow us on social media. That way you can get all the information about upcoming webinars that we're having. Again, you'll get links and all of that. So do follow us there. And our YouTube channel has recordings of basically everything that we've ever done here. So definitely give us a follow there. And now there were a couple of questions that came in. Um, One, this is recorded and it's going to be sent out to everybody in about 24 hours. There will be a follow-up email and you'll get a link to the recording to our YouTube channel. So all of that will be available to you. And then one question that came in that was actually really important was, how can you become a good writer when English isn't your native language? Do you have any like tips on what you could possibly do if you're struggling with writing in general because of that?
Oh, that's a great question. So my last slide, one of the last ones, was all about practice. So that's part of it, practice. The more you write, the more confident you're going to be, the more comfortable you're going to be with the language. So writing is really important. Reading is super important. The more you read in English or whatever language you're trying to write in, the more you read in that language, the more it'll become fluent for you. So reading is important. When you do write something, read it out loud. Make sure that it makes sense. Now, you might need to read it for someone else too. It's always a good idea to have someone look over it or to practice reading it for someone else, because that's going to help you in every way, right? In the spoken word and then reading and writing, you're doing all of those things when you write something and then read it out loud. So that's important. I would also say, consider using tutoring. We have English language learning tutoring that also does paper review. So if you're ever interested in having a tutor look over it, that's another option. And just practice, ask for feedback, be open to feedback, and I think that you'll find you will improve very quickly.
Awesome. This one is honestly, I think, highly relatable to a lot of people. Do you have any tips on how to write a good paper, even if you're not interested in the assigned topic? That's a big part that this student has noticed in college. So, like, how do you go about really formulating a paper and structure that is really good when you don't
You
want?
just don't care.
Yeah, I wanted to try to make it a little bit nicer than just don't care, but you don't care. So, how do you go about that?
Yeah, that happens. And sometimes you can find a way to put a slant on it that is something you care about. Sometimes the assignment is a little bit more open to interpretation than maybe the way that you're reading it. So it wouldn't be bad to ask your instructor, like, would it be okay if I wrote a little more like about this? Does this still fit? And maybe that's something that you're a little more interested in. A lot of times the answer will be yes. Maybe sometimes it'll be no. But I notice a lot of times students put themselves in a box. They think I have to write it just like this. And instructors are a lot of times interested in somebody that's going to try to be a little more creative with it, or write something a little different, because they're reading hundreds of these. So when someone does something a little unique, sometimes that's refreshing. So don't be afraid to try that, but ask first just in case, so you don't do something and then your instructor goes, what are you thinking? So that's one thing. You can also, the writing can be dry. It can be. So especially technical writing, which I remember in college taking business and technical writing. And at that time I thought it was terribly boring, and it can be. So it's not always going to be something that you're interested in, but if ever you have an opportunity to choose your topic, then go in the direction that you do find interest in. And, I don't know, that's the best advice I have. I think sometimes you're just going to have to write something that you're not in love with. Hopefully you get into writing, and maybe you're just taking some of the basic gen ed classes right now. And those are always the hardest, because you're not into your passion yet. But when you get into topics and classes that are more based on what you're majoring in, you will start to find that you're writing things you enjoy. If you're not, then one other thing to think about is, are you in the right major? Maybe you're doing something that you're not passionate about. And if that's true, then just take an honest look at it and say, am I doing what I want to be doing? Because every assignment I do is just boring. So another thought.
I will also say that if you're writing a paper that's not interesting to you, that might be the time where you want to look at the rubric and see, all right, make it a checklist of like, what do I need to get through to get a good grade for this, possibly? What do you think about that, Amy?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, awesome.
Great idea.
Thank you. I sometimes have those. So one question that I did see popped up multiple times was actually if people would be able to get a PDF version of this slide. Is that something that we'll be able to provide to people in the follow-up email, Amy?
Sure, we can do that.
All right, awesome, because I know that we've gotten many questions about that. Let's see. Okay, so there was one that you kind of mentioned earlier on with using synonyms for said or wrote, or kind of using those kind of words over and over again. How do you find what flows the best where you're not using the same words to ascribe to a sentence over and over, but you're not using too many different words where it just sounds like you're pulling basically from a synonym list? Like, how do you find what's a good balance?
Good question. I would say that you don't want to replace every single time you use the word said in your document. I mean, said is really not a great word. So that's probably not the best example. But if you find that you use one word a lot and you don't want to replace it every single time because then you think it starts to sound a little weird, well, then you only replace it every third time or every fourth time. And don't replace it every single time in your paper. Also, just because a word is short or simple, it doesn't mean it's not good. So sometimes we try to replace these short, simple words with these, elaborate words that nobody knows the meaning to. And that's going to come out sounding a little weird too. So you only want to do that sometimes. So don't always just replace words just because you think you should. Replace words when you think you might be able to convey what you're trying to say more effectively, when you think it might come out, maybe you'll make something that is significant, even more significant by the word choice, or when you're reading it and you start to hear yourself saying the same word over and over again. When you start to replace those words, don't forget to read it out loud again and see how it sounds. And you might catch, oh, I really tripped up when I said that word there. That must not flow very well. Let me go back and put the word I had before, or let me try something else. So it's all hit and miss. It's all practice. It's all reading out loud. But just like I said, we think we want to sound smarter. And sometimes when we want to sound smarter, we just go a little too far. So finding the balance, yep, you got to find it. I would say just don't replace every word.
Yeah, and then kind of similarly to that question, we did get a question asking what types of sentences will catch a person's attention. So I'm guessing that this is probably going to be around like the thesis statement in the first paragraph to like really hook people. So can you give a bit more information on kind of how you would write a hook to make sure that people are interested in what you're going to be writing about?
Sure. A lot of people, a lot of writers, a lot of students use a question for a hook. Have you ever blah, 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 blah. That works sometimes. I am not the biggest fan of it, and that's just maybe because I've taught for a long time and I just see it's overused. So sometimes a question works. It's not my favorite. What I would prefer is maybe a startling statistic. Maybe you found some research and there's some crazy statistic, 9 out of 10 students plagiarize their papers in their first English class in college. I don't know, I made that up, that's not true. But if that's pretty startling and that's gonna get someone's attention. So as a quote of a statistic is cool. I wouldn't recommend doing like an exclamation. That's a little cheesy a lot of times. And that's kind of how we start writing when we're young. So you kind of want to graduate from that. Let me think what else you could start with. Other hooks. Remember, you're just hooking the person. You're not reeling them all the way in. So you just want to see if you can get their attention in some way. And sometimes you don't have to startle the person to get them to read your paper. So I don't want you to think that either. But think those are, if anybody else has another suggestion, type it in the question box and we'll share it out.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
I'm running out of ideas on that one.
Yeah, and then one more question, just kind of about word choice, and this is something that I find difficult, even in like the daily like emails that get sent back and forth. Transition words, so something like so or therefore, however,
Mhm.
stuff like that. Are there any ways aside from just pulling from a synonym list that you can kind of use those sentences but not make it seem kind of so standard, I guess, if that makes sense?
Oh, that's another thing that I used to have written out. So remember how I told you when I was writing my dissertation, I would have said and wrote. I would have some synonyms for those on a list, and I could just grab them and throw them in there. I just found that it was easier for me. The other thing I also had was transition words. I had a whole list of additionally and therefore and all those kinds of words too. I found that those are a really good way to link paragraphs together. So I find that they work really well at the beginning of a paragraph if it makes sense to be there. I also find sometimes that's another one of those things that students try to put in to make it sound good or make them sound smarter, and it doesn't fit. Make sure, it fits what you're saying. Is it really a however? Does however fit here? Think about what that actually means before you put it in there. I would say you don't want to have those a lot of times throughout your paragraph. It does become a bit heavy. So try to have those words, more at the beginning of the paragraph. Also make sure, and I'm using words as I'm saying this, so also I'm doing it as I'm talking to you. Make sure that you also know when the comma goes, because there's usually a comma going to be around it. So make sure that's there. Otherwise, that is a big mistake that students make. But I think transition words are very important to help the flow of your paper. So don't be afraid to do it. Still use them, just don't use them in every sentence or every couple sentences even. It gets a little much.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, if you are looking for a list of transition words, like something like thesaurus online would be a great choice for you, correct?
That's correct.
All right,
Yes.
yeah, because
And one thing I want to say really quickly, Maxine, is that I know that a lot of you are looking for like a specific answer. Do this. This is the way to do it. And writing isn't like that. Writing is subjective. Some of your teachers and instructors are going to think you're an amazing writer, and others are going to say, oh, that wasn't good at all. It's so, it just depends. Everybody has a different style. And so you're aiming to get better and better by being more clear, more succinct, more learning how to make your writing flow better. All of these things you're trying to do, but there is not a specific like formula for perfection. You have to find your way.
agreed. All right, we have time, I think, for one more question. But before we get to that question, I did want to say back to talking about hooks. We did get some people mentioning that stories can be great hooks, or a metaphor or an anecdote that kind of depicts imagery. That could be something that can
Yay.
be really helpful to kind of get people
Thank
into
you.
whatever writing you're doing. So thank you to everybody who did come up with those ideas and send
Great.
them into the
Tell
chat.
a story. That's an excellent one. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, and then I think the last question kind of goes back to accidental plagiarism, which I know is a fear that a lot of people have, especially when it comes to things that might be what you consider common knowledge. So whether it's a fact that you heard years ago or you kind of learned how something works, how do you go about making sure that it's not an accidental plagiarism when you're writing about it? Do you have to always go back to try to reinforce that with the with the citation, or can you talk a little bit more about that?
No, you don't. Common knowledge is common knowledge. It's okay to write common knowledge things and not have to cite it. But if you heard something on the news last week and that you heard about, some specific event that happened or a statistic, then, and you're like, where did I hear that? I think I was watching the news, but I don't remember where it was. That's when you need to take the time to go find it, go look it up. You don't want to just say it because it did come from something recently. And it's a statistic. You don't ever want to assume that a statistic is common knowledge. It's not. So those kinds of things you want to research. But yes, common knowledge things, you're fine. If you're going to give a definition for something, you should go look for it. You shouldn't ever define something without some sort of reference to go with that. And let me think, what else? Yeah, sometimes you can get around it by saying, it was once believed, blah, 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 blah. Then that's okay to say it that way too. Sometimes you can get away with that.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. I think that's all we have time for today. But just as a reminder, everybody, there will be a recording that is sent over to you. You'll get a PDF of all the different slides, so you can always review them at any point in time. And definitely follow us on Facebook, on Instagram, social media. That way you can keep up to date with any other webinars that we have going on. But thank you again so much, Amy, for your presentation.
Thank you.
All right, well, have a wonderful rest of the day and enjoy the weekend, everybody.